Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining our primetime Whitetail Tactics Masterclass for the evening. We're getting, it's hard to believe October's already half over. We're getting right into the heart of the whitetail season, at least for folks that live in the northern reaches of the country here. We'll get going in just a minute or two here. Want to give everybody time to get settled in and get logged in and all that. So, a couple housekeeping items. Your audio and video are turned off, so we can't see or hear you. So no worries if you've got kids or dogs or anything making noise in the background. If you do have to leave early or you want to, go back and rewatch a portion of the class, it is being recorded. So we will email you the YouTube link so that you can watch it. That'll come into your inbox tomorrow evening. We do have some time for Q&A. We'll leave plenty of time at the end of the class. So please use that Q&A box. Should be down along the bottom of your screen. I see some people are already in the chat there. Chat is great if you just want to say, who you are, where you're from. Chat is not a great place for questions. They just kind of get lost in there. That's why the Q&A is there. They're easier for us to keep track of and respond to. So hop in that Q&A and drop some questions there. And with that, I guess we'll get into it. My name's Jack Headland. I'm not going to be doing a whole lot of talking today. I do love me some whitetail hunting and grew up doing it, but we have our in-house whitetail guru, Jared Larson, on the other end of the line here. So he is going to be taking us through, how he thinks about whitetail hunting this time of year, what he's looking for as far as terrain features, and then some of the functions of the app that he uses to help stay organized and scout and do all that good stuff. So, Jared, how's it going tonight?
Appreciate the intro, Jack. Yeah, no, we're doing good. Hopefully everybody in here, I see a lot of people chiming in from all over the country. Even in New Brunswick just popped in. So, yeah, I would love to see in the chat if people have been out in the woods, what they're seeing in their area, whether scrapes are getting laid down, if they've seen any young bucks feeling feisty and frisky, our cameras firing up. I know for me personally, I've probably made 6 or 7 sits in the last 2 weeks. Actually got busted by a real good buck that I've been trying to kill for a couple weeks on Monday. Wind swirled on me with him at 80 yards, and that was the end of my evening. But yeah, really looking forward to these next couple weeks here, as I'm sure most of you are, because the whitetail woods are going to be heating up. So, yeah, with that, I'll kind of jump into it here. I'm going to share my screen, which is on web map. But basically it is the same thing that you see, really when you are using your phone app. It just, allows a little bit of a larger screen that I can manipulate a little bit better, during this class. So Jack, can you see my screen here with web map?
Yep, we got you.
Perfect. So yeah, I'm gonna dive right in. I'm gonna kind of start with some of the layers and tools that I find most helpful in my whitetail pursuits. Jack is gonna be here, and if you guys throw questions in the chat or have like a quote unquote like live question, like, oh, why'd you think that ridge held doe bedding or whatever, he'll try to be my live color commentator and chime in with those so we can address them kind of as we're going in context as best we can. But yeah, as he mentioned, I'm planning to do about a 30-minute run through of the features and how I'm looking at breaking down a property from a whitetail perspective, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A, and hopefully then we'll be on our merry way to sitting in a tree over the weekend. So with that, this is kind of just an example property. Everything that you're going to see tonight is just kind of an example property. This is not my go-to onX account, because I like to keep those pins hidden, just like the rest of you guys. So first and foremost, I'm going to kind of start with waypoints. I think those are kind of the foundational aspect of onX, along with some other content that you're able to mark up. But first and foremost, you're seeing on a lot of these tree stand waypoints, this little bubble above them that has 9 southeast. So I'm going to click this tree stand icon, and on any given waypoint. Doesn't have to be a tree stand waypoint. It could be a bed, a bull elk, or a mountain goat for that matter. But you can add our wind tools to any given waypoint. I'll create a new one just so you guys are able to see what that kind of looks like. So we have this waypoint here. We're going to throw it over here, and we'll say that this is a ladder stand, and we'll make it blue like the rest of them. Once you save that waypoint, you're going to get this, what we call like an info card that pops up. So from there, you can set the wind direction. So you can do one of two things. You can either have it show current wind, at which point it's just going to show you what the current wind is, or more beneficially, in my opinion, you can set your optimal wind. So let's say that this stand hunted on a south and a southeast wind were kind of the predominant winds that you'd be confident hunting on. You can apply that, and then just like that, as you see, there is a southeast wind over there, and it is green. So that is how you set optimal wind. And then of course you see all of these different pins that have optimal wind. And then beyond optimal wind, we also have something that we call wind calendar. So if I click into wind calendar, it's probably going to take a second to load here. But as you can see now with this one individual location, it gives you the forecast with the wind and whether it's good, bad, or okay for the next 7 days. So a great planning tool to understand, when your favorite spot is going to have that good wind that you can go sit. Additionally, if you wanted to see the wind forecast on all of your spots, you can click wind calendar in your app. It's going to just be in your map tools menu option on the web map. It's on that right hand side there with the wind blowing icon. And then you can see all of the different stands. Again, this isn't my main account, so none of these stands are named, but you get the idea that if you had your south side gap, your north side pinch, grandpa's blind, so on and so forth, you could at a glance see, for today, tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday, what the wind is doing across your stands, just helping make the decision of where you can go sit just that much simpler and that much more streamlined when you're looking at your map. At a glance, you can say, okay, well, today I got two options that are green. Those are my kind of two options to go sit. The next tool on waypoints that I use quite a bit actually in the whitetail woods is this range radius that you see these blue circles around a couple of the waypoints that I have here. And so I'll again add one to this waypoint here. So this waypoint radius, you can set it either in yards or miles. Miles, I don't have too many applicable use cases for miles in the whitetail woods, but what I do use it for in particular is when I'm trying to slip in on bedding areas, be them buck bedding areas or doe bedding areas, and understanding, okay, let's say that it was a known doe bedding area that was, kind of off the backside of this pond here. We'll make it a bedding area. We'll save that. And, I'll actually do the inverse here. So I'll turn this one off. And let's say that you didn't have this set here and you wanted to go hunt on the leeward or the downwind side of this doe bedding area to try to catch a cruising buck. And what you could do then is set a waypoint radius, and let's say that you're real comfortable at hanging and hunting. Maybe you have a nice lightweight stand set up or a saddle set up, and you think that you can get within about 70 yards of that bedding area for an evening hunt and get set up and get in there quietly. Well, now it gives you a really clear picture of where that 70 yards within that core bedding area is. That way you could slip in and theoretically get right on the edge of that. If there's a southeast wind that's blowing this way, those bucks are probably going to swing around that pond, come on the downwind side of that bedding area. So you might want to position yourself somewhere right about there in that tree. And that gives you a very clear picture of, okay, you're probably about 80 yards off that core bedding area. So really like using that range radius tool just to verify exact distances from any point of interest. So those are like the main two waypoint tools. And then the other thing that I do just with waypoints in general is every year I pick a color to represent that individual year. So a couple years ago for me, it was yellow. Last year it was purple. This year it's the like very light teal blue. But really, when hunting a whitetail property, especially a place that you're hunting year after year after year, gives you a really good, clear picture of, year over year, where you were seeing sign, where you had your best sits, so on and so forth. And then, within your My Content, you can filter down on what you want to see as far as waypoints go. So if you go in here, you can then filter by waypoint color, by waypoint type. So let's say you didn't want to see the clutter of past years, you could filter only by this year's waypoint color or last year's waypoint color. So definitely recommend that you do that on your whitetail properties. Otherwise, they get to looking pretty cluttered up at times. And I think I just hid all of my content. So let's not do that. And go into my waypoints here, select, and we're going to select all. Struggling.
You have them in a folder, you should be able to go to the folder and unhide them, I think.
Yeah. We make this much simpler on the app with the old hide all show all button. So I'll jump into a few of the layers next. Beyond the toolings, waypoints is really my main tool that I use when in the whitetail woods. I'll touch on line distance and tracker here in a minute, but I'm going to zoom down to the south where I know I can find a few particular things I want to show. So zooming down here to Mississippi, one thing that I'm always keying in on when it comes to whitetails is habitat diversity. Really, most species that we hunt thrive on habitat diversity. And folks call habitat diversity a lot of different things. They call it edges, transition areas, habitat diversity. Those all are kind of speaking to the same thing. And that's where multiple habitat types in a close proximity are all coming together. And so one layer that I really like to use just to get a 30,000 foot view on where some of that habitat diversity exists is in our trees, crops, and soil layer. And this deciduous versus coniferous. So when you flip this on, you immediately see a bunch of this red and oranges that pop up on the map. As you zoom in a little bit closer, it further populates. These are called individual pixels. So each individual square is kind of representative of, I believe it's like a 30-yard by 30-yard area is what each one of those pixels are. And so very clearly you can see, right here, you have the orange brownish color is coniferous, the red color is deciduous, and right in here you can see, there's coniferous trees, deciduous trees, and then it even has a layer of mixed. So that's going to be coniferous and deciduous. So right here, you can also see with my hybrid map turned on that there's also a seasonal creek flowing through here. Looks like this guy might have like a little food plot going on here. So whether you're hunting public or private, just understanding where those habitat diversity, those edges, those transition areas, all kind of the same thing, where they are. And if you don't have a better place to start, that is always a great starting place, is understanding where that habitat diversity exists and keying in on those areas, because I can about guarantee you that you find a place of diverse habitats where they all kind of converge together, you're going to find some solid deer sign in those areas. So that's kind of one way I like to look for habitat diversity. The other thing I really like to do, where it is available, which I think our leaf off imagery is available in about 16 states. But when you turn on that leaf off imagery, it's another really easy way to understand where there is some habitat diversity, particularly with coniferous and deciduous trees. So as you look here, you can very clearly see up on the top left corner of my screen here, where I'm going to zoom in, you got a big stand of pine trees. And then so again, you can find those areas where there's some open fields, there's some water. In this case, Long Creek is going to be a more year-round standing creek because it is that solid blue line, whereas these dashed blue lines are seasonally hold water as a creek system. But again, really makes picking out that habitat diversity pretty dang easy. This spot's pretty interesting. Looks like this guy might have a food plot up here amongst the pines with mixed in deciduous trees. There's a pond right here. So there's a lot of different, micro ecosystems right inside of, I'd figure this to probably be about 30 acres. You can quick use our area shape tool. And yeah, about 32 acres. You have quite a few different micro ecosystems right within that 30 acres. And that is exactly what deer are often gravitating towards, is those areas of diverse habitats. So that's another thing that I'm really looking for. Another layer that I use quite a bit, especially this one more so on like public ground or ground that I'm pretty unfamiliar with, but acorn producing oaks. So this is a pretty awesome layer that basically through leaf reflectivity and a little bit of machined learning based on those parameters and satellite imagery, we're able to determine where likely mature oak trees are. Do we know that there is mast on them in any given year? Absolutely not. But I can identify where there are stands of mature oak trees. And so within that layer, actually, before I dive into the map here, when you go to your trees, crops, and soil layer, on most layer, there's a little details option. And so you can click that details option, and you can also refine it down to white oaks, red oaks, or mixed oaks. And so as you can see in this particular area, pretty fair amount of mixed oaks are in here as deciduous trees, a couple pockets of predominantly red oaks. But a great layer to get started, especially for, if you're in the South, you got quite a bit of time where acorns are a prevalent food source here on out. If you're in the Midwest, you probably have still another couple weeks where acorns can certainly be a predominant food source that deer are keying in on. But, if you're able to get out there like this weekend, I would definitely be putting some focus into finding oaks. Deer typically prefer white oaks. They have a lot less tannin and less of that bitter taste. So those deer will definitely gravitate towards white oaks before they gravitate towards red oaks. But if you're lacking on white oaks or the white oaks are pretty cleaned up, they will definitely transition over to those red oaks this time of year. So couple habitat layers that I definitely use quite a bit. The next thing I'm going to kind of move into is identifying topography. So we'll go to a new spot just for fun. I'm going to actually go over to somewhere without a ton of topography. We'll find a spot in Kansas here. So one new addition to onX is LiDAR. So LiDAR, if you're not familiar, the acronym stands for Light Image Detection and Ranging. And so essentially how it is gathered is through the use of lasers, from an aircraft of sorts. A laser is essentially shot down and it is able to measure the difference in surface across any given piece of ground with that laser beam. And our LiDAR is down to 3 feet of accuracy. So most of the topo lines that you're seeing, around 20 feet of accuracy. So every topo line kind of accounts for 20 feet of elevation, and our LiDAR is down to 3 feet. So just astronomically more helpful, especially in places with less topography. So here in Kansas,
Jared, can you go back and show us how you turned on LiDAR? Just went a little quick there.
yep, for sure. Yeah, that was my bad there. So just like in the app on web map here, you have what we call your base map card. So it's going to be square and it might say HYB for hybrid. It might say SAT for satellite, or it might say topo for topography. So if you click in that, this is where you have your different base map options. Now, LiDAR, leaf off imagery, and recent imagery are three base map options that are available only for our elite members. So if you're not able to turn on recent leaf off or LiDAR, it's probably because you do not have our elite membership. And then the one nuance with LiDAR is you cannot turn LiDAR on in satellite or hybrid. I'm trying to click LiDAR right now. And as you can see, it says not available for this base map. So LiDAR only works when you are on your topo map. And then as you can see, you can now flip LiDAR on and off. And I'll just show you a little bit of difference in this little Smoky Hill River bottom here. But without LiDAR, you have a couple of these topo lines, which actually in Kansas, right, we got 10-foot lines. So you can see that there's 10 feet of elevation gain here. But other than that, it's a pretty blank map. And so when you turn LiDAR on, you can see all these little nuanced ditches and folds in the terrain that deer are going to use to travel. Like this creek bed, for instance, really jumps out at me. Yes, there's one topo line here right near that creek, and that tells me that there's going to be a drop there. But when I turn LiDAR on, you're able to see that it's a pretty significant drop. And that's going to either allow you to really have a sneaky exit or entrance into a tree stand. Also tells me that like right here, it continues to go up in elevation. And I would guess that this little fold in terrain that you're seeing on LiDAR is probably like a little berm. And those deer that live in flatter country absolutely use any couple feet of terrain advantage that they can. So I would bet good money that they're going to be running on one side or another. I would guess the inside of this little berm right here. It keeps them a little bit less exposed, still allows them to be able to see. And so using this LiDAR function, I'm actually going to zoom up a little bit further north to show you another example of how it can be used to some spots that I know are going to have some logging roads. But it's pretty awesome when you can zoom into a property. Maybe it's your same property that like the back of your hand, or one you've never been to. But you can also use LiDAR in 3D. And so being able to look at it kind of across the landscape, you're able to see these logging roads that are in there that are phenomenal for human access. But also, there's a lot of times that deer will use these same roads that we like to use because they are creatures that follow the path of least resistance. Just like you and I, they don't want to hike up the steepest part of the hill. They want to go the easiest route from A to B and back to A. So using LiDAR just gives you a whole new perspective on what the terrain will look like. All these little creeks and draws, and like this, for instance, this right here is going to be pretty thermal hubby right here. So I'm sure, if you watch YouTube or you consume any type of whitetail content, you hear a lot of talk about thermal hubs. And so this is not, I wouldn't call this a quintessential example of a thermal hub, because there's really only one ridge that drops down into it. But I would bet good money that if you get down in here, I would say, kind of on these bottom couple lines of topography, this you're probably gonna find some interesting potential buck bedding in this area, because the odds that you get a consistent wind right here are about zero. You might get a consistent thermal pull, particularly early in the morning or late in the evening. But more than likely, your wind is going to be pretty much a toilet bowl in here, which makes it a really hard spot to hunt. But that's what makes it attractive to a mature buck is that he always can kind of be on his game in an area like this because he knows he has that wind swirl to his advantage. So using LiDAR really allows you to pick apart the terrain and understand exactly what you're looking at without ever being there. So again, like without LiDAR, yeah, you can understand what's happening here with some of the topography, but you don't get nearly the nuanced detail and the, almost standing there type of feeling that LiDAR gets you. Um, and then one other quick layer that has to do with kind of topography and how like terrain features layout that I really like to use once in a while is the slope angle and aspect. So I'm gonna flip on slope angle right now. So slope angle is really just telling you the pitch or the steepness of any given slope, whereas slope aspect is telling you whether it is north facing, south facing, west facing, so on and so forth. So slope angle, I kind of call it like topo for dummies. So if you're not like super familiar with topo and reading elevation changes, what you're looking at here is a color gradient, which at the top right hand side of my screen here, you can see the scale. So light green is going to be 5 to 10 degrees, yellow 15 to 22. Purple is going to be like a 40-degree slope, and blue is going to be 45 or greater. And so really just understanding, there's nothing crazy steep in this particular spot, but over here, where you have that purple, that's going to pretty much be a cliff. And so by flipping this layer on, you can really get a good idea of how deer might use a particular area just based on the terrain, because if you're cliffed out, more than likely a deer is also going to kind of be cliffed out of that area. And you can really utilize those as good terrain funnel pinch point types of topography. So those are a couple of my favorite layers when it comes to the whitetail woods. Jack, any questions we want to fire through here in real time related to anything I talked about recently?
Yeah, I've been chatting with Doug here talking about LiDAR. Can you just show kind of how to read LiDAR? He had some questions on, if the dark areas are consistently drops or climbs. And he asked, do you have to use it with topo? There was a couple questions on that. Folks, you do have to have your topo base map turned on for LiDAR to work. But would you mind just kind of showing how to read that LiDAR with the different color shading for folks that are unfamiliar?
Yup, 100%. Just flipping some waypoints on here right quick that I made earlier today to some spots I want to zoom into. But yeah, so LiDAR here. So the way that I read this LiDAR and is these dark areas, like you can kind of see right here. You have a much darker shading on the, I guess that would be like the north side of this little ditch than you do the south side. So that darker shading is going to be a steeper pitch. That's going to be like this little wall right here is probably going to be an almost like straight vertical drop. It's probably not going to be a very far drop, maybe 5, 6 feet. Whereas over here, you don't have any of that almost deep gray black. So that's going to be a much more subtle drop off. And then, similarly over here. So right here, I imagine that if you walked to this little spot, this is probably going to be a giant rock or, it might not be like a big boulder, but it might be like a little rock face that is like covered with dirt and vegetation on top. But when you get to the edge, that's probably going to be a good 10, 12 foot drop off of the face of that rock. So that's how I'm reading this LiDAR. And then, because you always have to have topo on, that's going to really help you determine whether it is an ascending or descending slope. And so, anytime that you have topo lines that are generally pointed and have like a rounded out, that means you're either gaining or losing elevation. Which really the best way to determine that is if you're unsure of whether that this is a top or a bottom, what you can do is flip on hybrid. And well, unfortunately, this one does not have a natural creek within it. But most of the time, these are going to have a natural creek. And so if you're unsure if you're looking at a top or a bottom, there's a couple things you can do. You can throw it into hybrid, and most of the time, you're going to see a little blue line in the bottom where there's going to be a seasonal creek. Otherwise, what you can do is you can always throw your map in 3D. And so right now, I just threw it back into 2D. But if you throw it into 3D and then on your mobile application on your phone, if you put two fingers on the screen at the same time and either push up or pull down, that is going to tilt your screen and allow you to visually see, where that terrain change is. Or if you're on a computer, on a Mac, it is control. And actually, I think on a PC, it's control as well, in order to tilt and pan the map. So all I'm doing is holding control, left clicking, and tilting that map so I can see, all right, clearly this is a bottom. Clearly here are the tops of those ridges. And anything that seems to have more contrast, a darker tone, is going to be a little bit steeper of a drop than anything that you're seeing that's lighter. And then the other thing that I'd be remiss not to say when talking about 3D is I use the heck out of 3D elevation exaggeration. So if you have an area, this is an area in Wisconsin that has plenty of country, so it's not super needed here. But you know what? I'm gonna go find somewhere where it is super needed because this is actually one of my favorite features when it comes to flat country. So let's go down somewhere a little flatter. Southern Iowa, that'll work. Um, well, still more topography than I wanted there. So we'll go back to our old friend Kansas. So in this area where you don't have a lot of topography, you're looking at, oh, what do we got here? Over the course of 200 yards, we gain 20 feet of elevation. So that's really a quite gradual slope. If I throw my map into 3D here, there's barely any difference in 3D to 2D. We're looking straight across the landscape, and you can hardly tell that there's an elevation gain. But if you throw 3D elevation exaggeration, it's going to distort your view a little bit. So you kind of just got to be patient with it as you play with it. But now, as I zoom back in and I pan the map, you can see how much difference was created with this 3D elevation exaggeration slider. And you can really distort the terrain to understand exactly how it's going to lay out when you get there. So, looks like right here, this is definitely a man-made pond. Here's like the little, dam, levee, whatever you want to call it, that they built here. Very clearly, that's going to be a berm, and you got this nice drop off into this ag field. This is like a pretty sweet creek bottom here. And then once again, if I remove all of this elevation exaggeration, forgive the distortedness of the map for a minute. That's just it trying to catch up. But now, again, you're in just regular 3D, and we'll go to the same exact spot here. And yeah, you can tell that like this creek bottom has a little bit of drop off, and you can still tell that this is a man-made pond, but it's nowhere near as clear as it was when you had that 3D exaggeration cranked all the way up. So those are definitely like my favorite features as far as picking apart different pieces of terrain. Now, real quick, I'm going to dive into talking about just kind of like some scenarios, some map breakdowns in different portions of the country. I got this spot in Kansas, I got a spot in Wisconsin, and I got a spot in Mississippi. And if you guys got particular habitat types that you want me to kind of look at, I'm happy to go try to find one and do so. But starting in Kansas here with a lot flatter terrain, more open country, I just randomly picked a spot on the map and kind of picked out areas from a map. Again, I've never been here, so this is my theoretical e-scouting of what I would be looking for when I look at a map in an area that I've never been. Now, I do this all the time on properties that I've hunted for years for whitetails, and every year without fail, by staring at a map and then going and ground truthing it, I find something of interest on there's a Wisconsin property. I grew up in Wisconsin. I've been hunting this particular property. I think this is year 7. It's 300 acres, and every year I find somewhere on the property that I'm like, man, how did I never discover this little terrain nuance or this funnel or this pinch point? And so every year I'm constantly looking at a map, even if it's a property that I believe I'm intimately familiar with. But looking at this area, kind of what stood out to me, of course, you got this really nice creek bottom. This is really the main piece of cover that's running north-south. You don't have big blocks of timber really in any direction. So you're looking at a lot more open country. But things like this stand out to me. This little isthmus of trees. So the reason this stands out is you have this cover that's running from north to south here along this creek bottom. But then this little isthmus of trees right here is connective tissue, if you will, to this like next small section of cover, which then kind of goes, it bleeds a little bit to the southeast, bleeds a little bit to the northeast. But deer in this open country, they're not going to be afraid of walking through the open country. They're certainly going to use the topography to their advantage. They're not going to stand on this knob and silhouette themselves, or at least a mature buck isn't going to. But anytime that you can find an isthmus of cover, a fence row, a row of trees, maybe it's just simply a big swath of really healthy switchgrass CRP type of stuff that's connecting between two ag fields. But anytime that you can find like some connective tissue or isthmus of cover that connect two larger pieces of cover, that's an area that I kind of call like a vegetation created pinch point. Those deer are without a doubt going to be using this little isthmus of cover as they're traveling, particularly from east to west, getting in or out of this cover to the north and south. So things like this jump out to me at a map as great places to start. Pending on what you see when you get here, boots on the ground, this gives you a viable option to hunt on a couple different wind directions. Again, I'm theorizing that these deer are predominantly using this traveling east to west. So if you had a north wind coming out of the north here, you could position yourself on the south side of this piece of cover to hopefully catch those deer cruising through this piece of cover, keep them, upwind of you. And inversely, if you had a south wind blowing south to north, you could sit on the north side of this piece of cover, have that wind in your face, and still hunt those deer traveling here. And then additionally, I'm always looking for where there might be potential bedding areas. For me, the two obvious giveaways for bedding areas is subtle ridges or rises. Deer like to be elevated, just like anybody does that wants to be able to see and feel like secure, if you will. So, as you can see on the topography here, you have a top right here. You have a top right here. And I'm assuming that this is probably not ankle high grass. I could be completely wrong, but I'm assuming that this is probably some CRP type, native prairie grasses. It could be full of cows and it could be ankle high when I get there. And this e-scouting might be absolutely worthless. But that is, kind of the case with e-scouting. So often you have to get there, you have to put your boots on the ground, and you have to suss it out a little bit. But these areas, to me, what stood out is I'll flip LiDAR on again. So I go to topo, and you can see right here that there's just a little subtle draw right here. But there's definitely a little bit of topographic change right here. I'm going to flip on hybrid. There's some cover right there. They're definitely elevated on the top third of this piece of ground. And so this to me looked like it could very well potentially have some bedded deer somewhere in these couple acres right here. Same thing over here. They're on the top third of this ridge. There's definitely some cover with what are looking to be some type of maybe cedar tree out here. And again, I'm anticipating that this is some tall grass that they're able to bed in. They'll put the wind at their back. They'll look down towards the cover. So like this, I would potentially see that they might be bedded here on like a south wind or maybe an east wind. That way they're able to look down below them, have the wind coming over their back. And understanding where deer are bedding is just super crucial for entrance and exit, making sure you're not blowing your hunt before it gets started, and really understanding where those deer are going to be traveling from to or to from, depending on if it's a morning hunt or an afternoon hunt. So with that, I'm going to, unless Jack chimes in with something that is relevant there, I'm going to go up to Wisconsin and look at some hill country here and kind of break down what I would call like a pretty quintessential rut funnel. And again, break down some areas that I think would be great potential bedding areas to hone in on.
Yeah, Jared, I just want to mention there's a lot of great questions in here. There are some questions, people requesting certain areas or like specific WMAs. We're probably just not going to be able to get to those tonight. There was one about, hey, this WMA in Ohio is really difficult to hunt. Can you talk us through that? Without having kind of on the ground knowledge about why it's difficult to hunt and some of that local knowledge, those are just really hard questions for us to answer tonight, folks. We wish we could help everybody out, but we're probably not going to be able to get to, every specific example of this WMA or that WMA and things like that.
Yeah, the idea here and what I was hoping to try to do by showing a spot in Kansas that has very little topography and a lot of open country with some creek bottoms. Wisconsin here, which is like hill country, a lot of big woods, as you can see, interspersed ag, lots of creek bottoms. And then I was going to zoom down to an area. I can't remember if it was in Mississippi or Alabama, but again, it's a lot flatter, in the deep south, which just hunts a little bit differently. That way, hopefully, you guys can grab some of these little nuance and nitpicks that I'm bringing to light in that type of terrain and hopefully apply it to similar terrain that you might be hunting. Um, so diving in here, I'm going to first start over here and just kind of show you what I got going on with these white lines. I'm going to flip it into LiDAR again. I mean, we've only had LiDAR live for, I think it went live in early August. So it's only been a couple months, but I tell you what, anymore, I probably spend 70% of my time in LiDAR, whereas 70% of my time used to be spent on hybrid, but LiDAR just opens up so much visually that otherwise was unavailable. So what I'm looking at here is an area that I would predict to be a pretty awesome spot to sit at any point starting maybe October 25 through November 20th. It's just an area that on a map to me looks like there are a lot of paths of travel that go through one kind of clearly benched out area at the bottom of a pretty steep ridge. And so what I'm looking at here, I'm going to flip it to hybrid for just a second. So this is a lot of timber, just a lot of big woods. There's an ag field right here, creek bottom here. This is kind of like, this is probably put in some type of ag, alfalfa or some rye or greenery of sorts. But as you can see on this topo line here, there's this big empty area in between lines. So that is a bench. That is exactly what folks are talking about when you talk about a bench is a widened area within a sloped piece of topography. So I would still call this a ridge. You got the top of the ridge here, it drops down, it benches out right here, and then it continues to drop down into these different creek bottoms in different directions. So this benched out area is super interesting to me because when I flip on LiDAR, you can see that there's this woods road, probably not a logging road, but probably just a woods road that was created who knows how long ago. But that is an interesting path of travel to me. Again, deer are going to often take the path of least resistance. You might find that there's actually a really heavily worn deer trail 20 feet up above that logging road, but same thing applies. I would almost guarantee you it's going to wrap around this ridge and it's going to come through this bench. And then where it goes from there, it very well might go right down this nice subtle ridge out to this ag field. It very well may go down this creek drainage right here to the north. They may well wrap around this steep ridge and go down this backside here. But this is an area that just with all of these little drainages, this great bench, a couple food sources within close proximity. When you can find an area like this that has multiple funneling features, and when I say funneling features, what I'm looking at is this big ridge here. Like you can kind of see this is going to be fairly steep. It almost looks like a pyramid. Deer are probably not going to walk straight up that. They might if they're spooked or what have you, but general travel, they're not going to go just straight up this. They're also, they're going to wrap around there. They're likely to funnel up these creek drainages and draws, especially when they can put thermals in their favor. So anytime in the early morning and late evening, those thermals are likely going to be dropping before the sun is up and warm, and after the sun has set and it has cooled down. They're going to put those thermals in their face and they're going to walk up these creek drainages. And again, like that's the path of least resistance if they want to get from this area over the top down into this area. So something I'm always looking for these next couple weeks is what you hear people referring to as a rut funnel. And this would be exactly that in my mind. So areas in big hilly country, it is much easier to find a rut funnel in those types of areas than it is in a lot of that flatter, lower lying terrain. But when I shoot down to the south, I'll kind of find an example of one down there. And then here again, I'm kind of picking out what I believe would be very likely doe bedding areas. And the reason that I think these are going to be doe bedding areas is you can tell they're all based on a ridge system. So here you have the very high pinnacle. You have a slight drop off, another pinnacle, and another pinnacle. And all of these ridges slowly bleed down and lose elevation. And then on top of that, they're all pretty close to a food source. So egg field here, here. You got one over here. So I don't often find does bedding like way up towards the pinnacle. Usually they are somewhere in the lower 2/3 of a ridge system. Certainly at times you'll find them at the very tops, but they're not traveling nearly as far as a buck from their food source to their bedding area. So anytime that you can find these falling finger ridges, those are likely going to be doe bedding areas on different predominant winds depending on what the hot food source is at the time. So that's in hill country. I think honing in on doe bedding is easier probably than anywhere else. You might have to check a few of these falling finger ridges in order to hit that doe bedding, but those are pretty quintessential areas. And then this little red line, I just think anytime that you can find these nice gradual ridge tops, those are interesting areas to hunt to try to find a cruising buck that's looking to get downwind of doe bedding. And so as you can see, it's just a super flat top here. I figured they'd probably cruise on one side or another of this pinnacle. Same with this one. And that's what they're going to do. They're just going to cruise down here and checking these finger ridges for doe bedding to try to find that first estrus doe. And now I will zoom down to Mississippi or Alabama, whatever state Mississippi as it turns out. So I chose this spot because again, it's a little bit flatter, there's less topography, and it's super marshy, which I think is relatable in a lot of different places of the country that I've hunted anyway. But again, you got the Tallahatchie Tallahatchie River here. So a big river corridor. And honestly, just a lot of lowland swampy cover is what is in here. So again, I'm gonna flip it to LiDAR. And the reason that I kind of picked these areas as likely bedding areas for doe bedding in and around here is the water and these swamps. So when you flip on topo and anytime you kind of see if you really look closely, these are kind of like marsh grass icons in here that are blue. And then, of course, you have these ponds. Depending on the wind direction, when I'm looking at this, you have this like oxbow, sloughy, swampy area. I often find deer bedded, oftentimes with their back to water because it's very hard to approach through water while being stealthy. And again, putting the wind in their favor. So likely I would think that they're probably betting here on either a north or a west wind. They're facing to the east or to the south. They got that water to their back and they're able to see any danger that's coming through this thicker cover. But more importantly, they're able to hear anything coming to them. Same thing up here. They got this water system kind of to their northwest. And if you flip on LiDAR, you got kind of these creek drainages. There's a little bit of topography. You can see just some small humps in here that they are absolutely going to use. If they can put themselves on a 2 foot high little hump, that is what they are going to do to give themselves the visual advantage of anything that's approaching. And then likewise over here, again, this is just a nice little pond that they're gonna use the wind on a particular direction, probably something predominantly east, a little bit southeast, a little bit northeast, and bedding back in this corner where they can put that water at their back, let the wind come over the water. That way they can smell and hear anything coming from their six. And then while keeping an eye out, looking kind of to the west, if you will. And again, all of these areas are pretty close proximity to very likely food sources in the form of fields. Now, of course, there's other food sources, acorns, natural browse, all of those things. And then this just stood out to me as an awesome pinch point. Again, you have a good piece of cover here, good piece of cover here that's connected to the river and just gives an area that's going to pinch down and funnel deer through this little 25-yard, 23-yard wide gap. So areas like that on a map just jump out to me. And then this I have highlighted as just an awesome use case of LiDAR. I'm going to delete the line so you can actually see it. But something that you would never know existed without LiDAR is, again, I assume this to be just like a little berm that runs along the river here. Could also be a little ditch. This one's kind of hard for me to tell with the LiDAR, but it's definitely a couple foot elevation change that those deer are going to key in on when they're running the river. So those are some of the things that I'm looking for when I'm breaking down a property, especially one I've never been to. So with that, Jack, I'd love to get to a few questions here because I already talked longer than I anticipated to. You're muted, my friend. Jack, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
All good.
Um, so, this class, we're specifically talking about hunting the next 3-4 weeks. So this might be a little bit off topic, but Clint asked about thermal cover, which is kind of more of a late season thing. But if you
Yep.
have some ideas on, he just said, can you go over thermal cover?
Yeah, for sure. So we actually have a layer built specifically for this. I'm gonna go up to an area that I know is gonna have some. Getting myself caught up with my 3D here. So if you go into your hunt map layers and you go to trees, crops, and soil, thermal deer cover is a layer. And now I'm gonna have to zoom in order for that to populate here and find. So, I mean, it's super nuanced here, but you can see here it's labeled as spruce. So I'm just going to go back into that layer and just quickly kind of show you what we're calling thermal. So hemlock, fir, spruce, cedar, juniper, redwoods. But the idea here is you kind of got to have a little bit of knowledge of your area. What is the predominant wind direction in your area? You know, in a lot of places, it's going to kind of be north, northwest in the time of year we're talking about, late November, December, if you're really looking for that thermal cover. And then just finding, you know, a good area of that thermal cover where it's going to break the wind. The other thing to really understand when you're talking thermal cover and a layer that I touched on earlier is slope aspect. So if you turn on slope aspect, there's not a whole lot of topography here, so this isn't the most useful. But the slope aspect and really honing in on south facing slopes will allow you to understand where that sun is going to be hitting. And actually, well, I just found a bug because this little compass right here should have the legend of what purple, red, yellow is, as far as what direction that slope is facing. But if you pair that slope aspect layer with your thermal deer cover layer and understand what your predominant wind direction is, focus on those south facing slopes, focus on areas where you have thermal cover. You know, I guess in this case where I'm talking about, if a northwest wind is predominant, find an area that looks to have cover kind of to the northwest of where good bedding cover would be. So really focus on that aspect and where you can find some dense coniferous trees, and that's going to be a good start on thermal cover.
Well, let me see. There's a bunch of questions and you're trying to find some that are kind of answerable in this format. Um, David had asked a question about thermals,
Yep.
and how rain might affect thermals. Something I haven't really thought about, but yeah, how do you, if it's raining, I would expect a thermal, to act a little bit different than if it's a bright sunny day, for sure.
100%. This is actually, I've gained so much knowledge about thermals hunting in the West, just because they're a lot more predominant when you have a lot bigger, you know, terrain gaps, you know, whether it's, if you only have 100 feet of elevation, your thermals act less than when you have 1,000 feet of elevation gain. But in my experience, anytime that you get those super overcast, rainy days, the thermals are going to be slowed way down. So, for example, let's say sunrise is at 7:30 a.m. My thermals, if I am sitting, I'm going to throw this in 3D just so we can get a better perspective here. Let's say I am sitting in this little bowl right here. This isn't the best example, but we'll make it work. So, let's say my tree stand is right there. I am expecting my thermals, if sunrise is at 7:30, I'm expecting my thermals to be dropping down this draw right here at least until 7:45, 8 o'clock on a clear day. Until that sun has, you know, 15, 20, sometimes even 30 minutes to warm up the ground, those thermals are going to continue to drop. And then as soon as that sun has warmed up the ground, which it can change on any given day, you know, if it's 50 degrees at sunrise, your thermal effect is probably going to have a shorter window than if it was 25 degrees at sunrise. Those thermals are not going to pull down as hard. But if it's raining, I would really expect those morning thermals to continue to drop and suck down into this draw all the way maybe an hour after sunrise. So your thermals might still be playing downhill until 8:30, 9 o'clock. But eventually that thermal pull, like that sun rising, even though it's behind the clouds and the rain, is going to start coming up. But then same thing in the evening. You know, those thermals are going to drop, you know, maybe a half hour, 45 minutes earlier than you would expect them to if it was a clear day. So you're definitely going to have more time in those thermal zones in the morning and the late evening. Those thermals are going to drop. And then the tweener times, once the sun has warmed the earth, those thermals are going to pull up. But when it is raining and overcast, you're definitely going to have extended times of dropping thermals.
Awesome. Let's see. There's a bunch of these that are kind of uber specific that we might not, you know, are
Well, while you're
difficult to
finding the
answer.
next one, I'm going to touch on a new feature. So we just released this a couple months ago. I'm still kind of playing it out, and I've been doing a lot of note taking on how accurate I feel it is. But deer movement forecast. So there's a lot of apps out there that kind of try to help you predict when deer are going to show up. We have created a similar function. This is based on uh, over 50 different parameters, a lot of weather parameters, a lot of trail camera images, and everything is anonymized. But basically, it is understanding through machine learning when your best chance to see deer movement is. So it lives within your weather tab. We give you an hourly forecast, we give you the full weekly forecast, and you're able to understand, all right, if I only have one day to hunt this week, when does onX think deer are going to be on their feet the most? So give that a look. Would love to hear any feedback that you guys have on how you think our deer movement forecast is, because it's something we want to really continue to work on and improve. All right, Jack, do
Um,
we have a last winner or two as far as question goes?
here's one. Any thoughts on hunting north facing slopes or south facing slopes on a north wind? He says, I am hunting a north face mountain here in Ridge and Valley Mountains, central PA.
Yeah, so I can zoom over to PA and just kind of talk through what I would be looking for. All right. I don't know where in PA I am, but it's pretty mountainous, so this will work. So what I'm looking for in hill country where there's a lot of topography change. So we'll just use this as a real quick and dirty example. Um, Obviously you have this right fork Brooks Run, nice creek bottom here. And then you have this nice big ridge system, honestly, with a bunch of different finger ridges coming off of it. I'm actually going to put it into 2D so I can see this a little bit better. So here you have the very top of this ridge system, and then you have these drawn out finger ridges that are really going in all directions. So in this particular spot, again, I'm going to just kind of outline, here's the top of this ridge system right there. You got everything that's to the north of it up here. And what I would be doing is I would be putting some boots on the ground and figuring out what side of the top those does are bedding on. There's the big woods can be tough. There's nothing super obvious as far as a food source goes. There's not an egg field. There's not an apple orchard. I don't believe you can run bait in Pennsylvania. But what is interesting right here is this timber cut layer. So though our satellite imagery doesn't really reflect it, the timber cuts here definitely serve as kind of like a nature's food plot, if you will. Anytime you can disturb the landscape and cut out a bunch of the canopy, you're going to get a lot of that high stem count new growth, which often provides some really valuable forbs and browse for whitetails. So I would predict that you might have some doe bedding right somewhere in here off of these two timber cuts. Now, granted, this one's from 2010, so that's a pretty old one. This ridge would actually be more interesting to me, seeing as this one is from 2017 and probably has some better high stem count growth. But we'll continue to use this example. If those does are bedding right here, those bucks are going to come on the leeward side. So if you have a north wind here, those bucks are probably going to swing down around and come on the south side of this ridge. If you have a south wind right here that's blowing south to north, those bucks are going to come swing around on the north side of that bedding area. That way they don't have to walk right through the bedding area. They get the wind in their favor. They go on the leeward or downwind side of that doe bedding area to pick up any, of that estrus scent if there's a doe in heat that they're going to go harass. So that's how I would look at it, is understand what direction the wind is coming from, where you think the does are going to be bedded, and then hunt downwind of that doe bedding area, because that's how those bucks are going to cruise. Whether it's a ridge, whether it's flat as a pancake, they are going to key in on those downwind areas of doe bedding.
There was a few questions on the deer movement predictor. That is an elite only feature, right?
Correct.
Awesome. Yeah, so there's a few people that asked that. So if you do have the premium membership, that deer movement predictor is not available to you. But if you do want access to it, you can upgrade to that elite membership and that'll be available to you.
Awesome. Well, if you got one more, I'll certainly do one more. Otherwise, we can adjourn here, and hopefully some folks can put some of these mapping tips to use.
Yeah, we're over our hour time here, so I think we're good to wrap it up for the evening.
Awesome. Well, really appreciate all you guys sticking with us tonight, and hopefully learned a thing or two about ways to put onX to use. And yeah, best of luck this fall. Make sure to wear your safety harnesses out there, and at the end of the day, make sure that that you're having fun while doing it. So enjoy your deer camps, and best of luck this fall. Shoot straight.